Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody's doing well. It's my honor to be part of this today and to be talking with you. My name is Jeff Young. I'm the editorial director at EdSurge and host of the EdSurge podcast, which I'll talk more about. But I'm here talking about this topic that I'm really passionate about, which is podcasting, and looking at like how it's changing teaching and research. Because I actually think I think there is some profound change happening that's been going on in the last 10 years in higher education because of the rise of podcasting. And so I'm going to share some of these thoughts and along the way, some stories about my own podcasting, and hope it's helpful to people. Looking forward to some some questions at the end. First of all, again, a little bit about me. I'm at EdSurge, which we cover education, innovation in education. So that's on point for this conference and event. I was before that at the Chronicle of Higher Education for a long time as an editor and reporter. So I've been covering higher education for a long, long time, like more than 25 years, actually, even though it doesn't seem possible. But the favorite part of my job these days at EdSurge is hosting our weekly EdSurge podcast, which hopefully either you're already listening to or might find after this. But we come out every Tuesday, and I have literally made hundreds and hundreds of episodes talking to scholars and telling some narrative stories in audio about really tough issues, a lot of them around teaching in higher education. And so one of the things that I wanted to share, which is a little behind the scenes here, which is this is where I record the narration for the podcasts that you hear on EdSurge Podcasts, if you listen. Super glamorous. And it's because the acoustics in a closet are apparently pretty good because of the closing and the buffer. It's not quite, a studio, but I'm happy to hear and learn recently that I'm in good company. This is a post on Twitter or X by Ira Glass, who people probably heard of. He founded This American Life. He's probably one of the most famous audio storytellers in the business. And this is a post that he made showing him in his similar situation, recording narration for, I guess, This American Life or Serial or something. So this is, I say this mainly to just emphasize how low cost it can be to make a pretty high quality audio show, which is very different, as people know about, than video or other multimedia. And one reason I got excited about podcasting, I mean, being a written journalist for a long time before I did any audio, was that, okay, I'm sharing another behind the scenes here. At EdSurge, we have very good analytics, just like any media outlet these days, about who is, like roughly like who's reading and what they're doing, like, in an anonymized way. And you can see on here a story that I wrote today on AI and standardized testing. It has an engage time of 56 seconds, which means that the average someone spent on this article that I worked for a while on is about a minute. And that is not, it's not perfect. For my, sometimes it's one of those humbling moments when in a journalism thing. But honestly, it only takes a minute to read the story. You can that's fine. But when I make a podcast, and many podcasts, I'm sure people out there listen to podcasts, I hope so, and ours are 45 minutes usually, and the stats that we have are not perfect, but they indicate that people on average get 60-70% through the episode if they start it. And so that means a very different amount of attention and time that listeners are spending with the storytelling and the interviews and the ideas that we're putting out on the podcast, which is a pretty compelling thing that is part of the medium. Now, obviously, for the higher ed setting, it's been going really well. Some of the most popular podcasts out there in the country are made by academics, are made by people in higher education. As a local one there for you in Stanford is Huberman Lab, which is the most, it's the 17th most popular podcast in America on Apple podcasts, actually. He is a neurobiology professor at Stanford. and does this Huberman Lab Health podcast. Another couple ones that are just scholars doing their thing, but on a podcast very popularly. Cal Newport is at Georgetown. He does a tech podcast. That's the 14th most popular tech podcast. And I'll admit, I know there's other two, but I don't know Greg Jackson's, but history is a huge area of podcasting, and he's number 9. This is a professor at Utah Valley University, Greg Jackson, popular in the history podcast space. But those are just a sampling. Those are like very mainstream popular podcasts, which naturally, of course, scholars are guests on a lot of podcasts all the time. It just opened up more avenues, obviously like NPR and radio has interviewed professors forever, but now there's so many places that are popular where you hear the voices of professors really get to dive deep into their research and share that with a real popular audience. So it's this public intellectualism gone mainstream in a way that more and more people are consuming. This is just a reminder of how big podcasts and how mainstream they've gotten. And you'll see it around the year 2014, there's a bit of a curve change when the podcast Serial came out. Just to remind people, this is almost exactly 10 years ago. And it was the first podcast to reach 5 million downloads, which at the time was very different than what other podcasts were doing. And so this was a true crime podcast, but it was different. It was more than that. And I think it's really telling, and it's certainly not alone, but I think podcasts that have hit the biggest mainstream audiences, a lot of them were really not just about the story they're telling, but they're about, as Serial very much was, if people heard it, is about a murder, like kind of reinvestigating a murder. And sort of one of the premises of the show is maybe the person in jail for this murder didn't do it. But so much in this 12 episode podcast is about the process of criminal investigations. Now, of course, that's a popular topic in media, but it got into it with 12 hours of storytelling in levels and ways that you just never were done or weren't done in a mainstream way before. And I think that has been something that's kind of new in the podcast space, to really be able to show people behind the story in a way that it's cheap enough to produce, like I said before, with the cheap microphone and anybody can in their closet make a pretty high quality. Well, this is not someone's closet but it's still a lot cheaper to make 12 hours of this than any TV or movie documentary. And so it's a way in which it can feel like a humanities course in a way. Like and one of my favorite podcasts is actually by a Harvard professor, Jill Lepore, a history professor, and she does this podcast, The Last Archive. I'm not sure she does it anymore, but she's made a few seasons of this really incredible podcast about the history of how the idea of truth has kind of been questioned in our society. And you can picture, she didn't actually deliver this as a course at Harvard, but you can imagine it as a course at a liberal arts college. And this is available for free to anybody to consume. Now, there's one thing though that is, I think, worth noting. I'm curious what other people think. I don't have any evidence that there's a cause and effect here, but during the same time that podcasts have been going up, there's been a decrease in the number of students majoring in humanities and history, English, these kinds of fields. There are many reasons for this, but I would suggest that the idea that podcasts are out there and people know that they can consume these kinds of things they're curious about, but they're not going to major in. I think that there's not a total coincidence. I think there's something about the fact that people know, obviously there's other parts of the internet that has this content, but podcasts are probably the most prominent way. And at the same time, the same period of history we're talking about, from about 2015, when Serial came out, 2014, to now, you also see these public opinion surveys showing a growing skepticism or lack of confidence in higher education. Now, again, a lot of reasons. The cost of college is certainly one not to be ignored. But I think there's something about podcasts that, unlike even like MOOCs, these massive online courses that came out about 12, 13 years ago and were all the rage at Stanford and many places, those are around still. But I feel like podcasts are the ones that actually are used. People are listening to podcasts. And I did a podcast series at EdSurge just recently, that's still going actually, called Doubting College. And for that, I actually spent a lot of time at a public high school here in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I'm based, talking to students that are seniors and saying, what do what are your views on higher ed, whether you're going to go or not? And what I've learned and really hearing is that people do feel like, depending on what I want to do, I might be able to figure it out on the internet between podcasts and videos and other pieces of media that are free, or communities that exist online. So I think there's something really interesting about how this radical public intellectual that is wonderful is part of this broader information trend, um, and at a kind of a leading edge of an information trend where people's attitudes about what it means to get a lecture, right? I mean, really, these courses, these humanities courses I was referred to earlier, that the Jill Lepore one is like, it's like a lecture course. It's like an intro lecture course where there's not much engagement in a setting. Now, I know this is an innovation and education conference, and I I am hearing a lot of positive things from people I'm talking to and interviewing around the impact of podcasts on higher ed and in several different areas. But I think it's just interesting for me to think about like the broader picture to start out with. Um, as far as one area that I hear that podcasts are really changing the game and having making a kind of cultural difference in the academy is in scholars putting out podcasts based around their research area. And I think it's a really, a huge world. There's more of them. Every time I think I have a sense of how big it is, I don't think if someone has a stat on this, I would love to know it. But there are so many scholars doing their own podcasts, and they are being found by people in their discipline and people in the general public who happen upon them. But it is a new way of reaching people. And I came across this anthropologist, Ian Cook, who has a book out not too long ago called Scholarly Podcasting: Why, What, and How. And he interviewed about 100 academic podcasters of various disciplines, about why they do it, what they get out of it. It's a really interesting read. And he makes this point that he feels like the way people were sharing knowledge in the academy is broken with the traditional publishing methods, books and articles and different certain disciplines more than others, but that he argues that the podcasting is really changing things. Like he tells the story about, the way he used to get information at conferences, which is still happening. I'm sure you all know this world better than me. I'm on the outside as a journalist, but going to an academic conference, hearing a paper delivered or a couple papers, and then one person raises their hand and asks a question. A few people are in the room. One person raises their hands and asks a question. The question is more of a comment about their own work, and there's not a lot of way in which sharing and dialogue is happening. Meanwhile, he is excited about the fact that he sees scholars and also who gets to give those talks at these, society conferences, academic publishing, it's often people that have been around a while, or kind of the haves, or a certain set of people that get to give those talks. But podcasting has broken open to a lot of diversity in various ways of who can have their voices out there. And so he's very excited about what he's seeing from his research. And I feel like I've seen this as well about the barriers are low. And, there's ways in which people are using maybe a more prominent scholar is using their podcast to elevate somebody that they feel like, isn't getting enough attention, a young scholar they've heard of, or, there's a way in which it can kind of be this subversive reaction to the old model. He does say that he wishes that there was more peer review in scholarly podcasting, because it's also possible for someone to go on and on about something that maybe it's not in their field, or putting out information that's not accurate. So I'm not going to weigh in on that. But so there's all these, when something does happen like that, there are questions that come up about if that's are there guardrails in place? But I think it's an interesting point about who gets to have a voice And the other thing is, some of the podcasts out there, I think it's actually pretty typical for a podcast to only have less than 100 listeners. And while that might sound really low, he was saying that that's still more than many academics would get on a certain very scholarly topic. And so if you can find, a larger audience than is typical, then the number, okay, maybe you're not, Huberman Lab, but you're actually, that's not the right scale to think about if you're comparing it to how trading information has gone, and the real dialogue that can happen in some of these podcasts. I know too that the people making these podcasts, whether they're popular or not, are getting a lot out of them. One of the podcasts that I really like, I recommend if you don't listen to it already, is Bonnie Stahoyak's Teaching in Higher Ed. And she's a higher ed administrator. She's been in the trenches in higher ed for a long time. And so she has a teacher's perspective in higher ed that I don't have, but she has done her podcast for 10 years, I think now, and has just done every week these episodes where she talks to people. And she's pretty popular. So she's not one of those 100 podcasts, believe me. But I reached out to her when I found out I was doing this event, and I asked her what she's gotten out of her work in the podcast space. And she said this, which I'm sure you've read by now, but that this is something about the act of interviewing someone. If she reads a book and calls them up and does a podcast interview, that she is growing so much, that she's getting so much out of it. And it's helping her make connections and be in dialogue and push back and say, what about this? And I think obviously that's a spirit of the Academy already, but the fact that it can happen over time and space. And I know I know a lot of people take the time to do podcast interviews, for those podcasts, big and small, to have that kind of information sharing. Another area that is obviously, I know there are other sessions today at this event about teaching. And I have done a little bit of adjunct teaching in journalism over the years, and I have taught podcasts and audio storytelling. And I will say that it is fun to teach. It is an assignment, even if you're not teaching journalism, that is doable. That just having the active learning of having students pair up, and because the gear is cheap, I've even had people just use their smartphone to interview a colleague and first prepare for it, or another student, or interview some kind of person, researcher at the university they're at. And it can really be something that wakes people up, that isn't just the sitting in a lecture. And obviously learning by doing is something that there's so much literature on in the active learning space. And I do think that it's even if it's not a multimedia class, I see plenty of examples out there of people doing successful podcasts assignments. I've even seen examples where the podcaster, the professor, has created, kind of curated a podcast with the students, helped get it started, and then the podcast continues as like a student activity even beyond the class. And that's kind of, there doesn't have to be, these days, the students are pretty savvy, and learning some of the technical things are really so easy these days that you can focus on the material of being in dialogue, or whatever the subject of your particular class is. So I know there's a lot of interest and growing work in that area. And the other thing is professional development. I know Stanford, various offices within Stanford, and as at many universities around the country, are putting out podcasts, whether it's the Teaching Learning Center putting out theirs, or different areas of professional, like topics where even like the teaching in higher ed, I hear so many professors that go to that to learn how to teach better. And it is, back to Bonnie, one more quote from her, having this ability to plug into your ears a smart colleague, and as you're doing your dishes or walking the dog or whatever it is something that is a game changer as far as like making it easy to do a professional development, especially in teaching. I think I hear it's an area that isn't always rewarded in the academy. And so there may not be as many opportunities to take a lot of time off to go learn more if you're interested in some subset of making your teaching better. And so podcasting, and there's so much out there. That is one of the challenges of podcasts, as people know, is the discoverability, which is the fancy word for saying, how do you let people know you exist? Which is why so many podcasts are kind of low numbers. But then again, there are lots of lists and ways and events like this to learn about people doing some sub area of what you care about. I will share like one personal story that I've got to do in my podcast is I was lucky enough to do my undergrad at Princeton and had John McPhee, the incredible writer for the New Yorker, teach a class. He teaches a class there. He has for so many years now. I took his class, and he was just a huge part of why I do what I do now. And I actually was able to get him on the podcast talking about when he came out with this book called Draft Number 4, which everybody should read, on his like craft and what he thinks about writing. It's really like what he taught us in this class. But I got to thank him for the impact that he's had on me, which was super meaningful. And just being able to like let him know was fun. I want to leave some time for questions. I know we only have a couple minutes left, and I will see them in a chat box here. This is a QR code for the EdSearch podcast, or you could find it wherever you listen, or these are my contact information. I'd love to hear from folks as well afterwards. So I would also love to hear, my question to the audience is whether people have a favorite podcast, and whether they have, if anybody has used it in a teaching or research setting themselves. Standing by. There are one of the things that I did for the podcast a couple of years ago was something called Pandemic Campus Diaries, when everything was on lockdown. And for that, I basically connected with 6 universities, a professor and a student at each, and was able to talk and check in with them every week for a semester. And that was a way that it felt connected for me when everyone was locked down. But I heard from a lot of people that being able to hear from a student voice if you were a professor, or a professor's voice if you were a student, was a huge help in a time where people are isolated. And I think even now the pandemic lockdowns are over, people are still isolated in some ways, in some weird ways, because of so much remote work. Okay, here's one question. Thank you for who sent this in. When I was a teacher, I would have benefited from podcasts. I quit after the first 5 years because it felt so alone with decisions I was making. Yeah, I do hear a lot. There's a feeling of community on a podcast listener audience. I feel like I feel that way about some podcasts that I listen to, and hearing people that you're like, oh wow, this is a very minor, like sub discipline I'm in, or sort of very specific situation I'm in, and here is another person wrestling with that. I think a lot of people at a campus are like the only one doing their thing, or the only, that they're alone, as even though they're in community. Oh yeah, here's another question from the audience. I loved Serial. I really appreciated the connection you made with undergraduate majors and the rise of the influence of podcasts. Yeah, I think there is something. It's not just Serial. I think there are so many, and maybe Serial set the stage, but I don't know if people listen to Throughline at NPR. Throughline is one of my favorites these days. It's Serial, obviously. Serial Productions they keep coming out with new seasons, and there's so many ways in which you learn about like something that's in the news now, but you thought you understood it, but you didn't. You realize, or by taking a fresh look at a piece of history in today's lens, makes it just so different. Well, we are at time, and I really enjoyed this. I really appreciate the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be here. Hope folks are listening to podcasts, and look forward to seeing what people make. And if they do, and hopefully you'll listen to the EdSearch podcast. Nice to see everybody.